So I appreciate Bobby, and he's spending the night with acting like a 14-year-old girl. 13 or 14? 14. That he got to spend the night last night as a 14-year-old girl. So the reason I did that is because now people on the internet are saying, what? So now they got to listen to Bobby. Bobby's doing the book of Ephesians as part of what I wanted to always do is mentor someone else to start filling in, and something that I feel comfortable with when I'm gone. So basically what I'm going to say, I'm going to be gone a lot. No, I'm just kidding. But I appreciate that Bobby can fill in and that we have a really good connection. We both like the same awful college team. So we have something to share about. They used to be really good, right? So one day again, the University of Miami may walk through it. We're in Matthew. Here's something I stopped doing a long time ago. I stopped assuming that people knew what we were saying or what we were doing. So I started defining terms a while back when I became a pastor, and I didn't say words that people may not understand. You could say big theological words, and they get like glazed over. Matthew, in the opening chapter of his book, assumes you know what he's talking about. He assumes you know Israel's history, and he assumes you know what's going on. And he assumes, as he's writing it, the connection he has to the end of the Hebrew Bible, which is 2 Chronicles 36. He assumes you know that and why it ended so abruptly. He also knows how God works things out. If you ever picked up a regular Bible and it ends in Malachi, why it stopped, and you didn't get the rest of the story. It leaves you, and we'll cover some of that, probably not this morning. Last week I skipped this one because this takes a while, because Matthew skips names. Now, I'm going to say something, and I say this over and over and over again. I believe the Bible to be the true record God wanted man to have. It's inspired. If we don't understand something, it's because we lack something. It's not that God has contradicted himself. You with me so far? I think this is important to know, because when we go to the Word of God, it is the truth. We may not grasp it. So what I decided to do, since Matthew is a Jewish-style book, I'm going to ask the question and answer it. Because Jewish people, when they're teaching, they like to ask questions, and you ask questions, and then they ask questions, and they're answering them as you're getting schooled in that manner. So even before we started Matthew here, I had a few people walk up to me and say, I got a question on Matthew. Good, so do I. And prayerfully, my challenge to you is if I miss one, you can come up to me and I'll try and answer it the following week. Sometimes when a pastor answers a question that's given to him right away, he swallows his words because he usually exchanges feet. Okay, so be careful how I answer you off the cuff, and always what? Verify. Verify. So I'm going to do a lot of history today. So before you fall asleep, don't. Remember, the Bible from cover to cover is historical. And if you say, well, I don't like history, Pastor, you basically are left with two books, Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. And good luck with that. It's not written in a vacuum, it's written in a historical context. So when Matthew's writing his book, he's telling you certain things, and as we see, verse 17 says this, so go to Matthew 1:17. And this is a controversial passage because, again, if any of you know what I did with Isaiah 23, I said it's complex and not every commentary has an answer for Isaiah 23. You with me? And some people look at a pastor or somebody that's a Bible teacher or professor at a Bible college and think they know everything and every answer. And if you walk up to them and say, I have no clue, I'm as lost as you are, they're going to say, wow, this guy isn't as worth his weight in his diploma. Well, just fine, because diploma's paper and it burns. Study the Bible, spend time chewing it, spend time understanding it, and maybe you'll get some information I may not have. And we can sharpen each other. But when we get to verse 17, it's a very strange verse. Because what people want to do is nail down certain facts of it. And they say, okay, within the text of Matthew, does it prove verse 17? Verse 17 says this, therefore all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations, and from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations, and from the deportation to Babylon to the time of Messiah, 14 generations. But if you add up the names, it don't work out. It's not 14. If you go through history, it really doesn't add up. Because historical records have people that these records skip. So who's right? The historical record of skip things or Matthew's record of the genealogy of Christ? You know, I want to say this. I was going to do this morning. I was going to say, turn to the book of Genesis. Because there's two Genesises in the Bible. There's Genesis, where your Bible opens up right after the table of contents. That's the book of Genesis, right? And then there's Matthew, because the first two words in Matthew are book Genesis. So actually, you just open up to the book of Genesis. This is the beginnings. This is the important beginning. Our focus from the beginning of human history to the end of human history is always going to be on Jesus Christ. So when Matthew's writing his book, intended for a Jewish audience, he's got them nailed. They understand it. Not one of them would have questioned, 14? I don't get 14. That's not the hang-up. The hang-up is what's going on in this chapter. What is the focus that Matthew's trying to bring? And I think it's important to look at why things are there and why things are not there. So when you study the Bible, read with a view to say, why is this written this way and not this way? What's going on? Why is something left out or seemingly left out? Or was it done on purpose? So what we're going to do this morning in this sort of an hour is try and explore some of the names that are there and the ones that are left out. Why did he skip them? And I'm going to give you, listen, the Bible's really good, but as a Bible teacher, what I try to do is make it as clear as possible and say, here are the probable answers or possible answers. Give you options and then say at the end of the day, it may not be totally true. I'm going to say this before time, and I'm going to skip a couple of questions ahead because I want you to know how it'll fit together. My belief is here's how Matthew got this record, okay? How did Matthew do this? Did Matthew walk up to Jesus and say, listen, I got about 5 minutes to pen this down. Who'd you come from? Now, Jesus would have been able to answer that question. How would you have all answered that question? And if you did answer, if you could answer that question and go back 42 generations in your family lineage, ready for this? Who would you leave out and why? And then who would you include and why? Kind of get what I'm saying? So Matthew probably got this record. There's two possibilities, and there's only two that I can think of. Somebody will say, well, it's inspired. God gave it to him. Well, of course, but I think it's a bigger picture than that. Okay? Matthew's real name was Levi. He was probably from the tribe of the Levites. And since he was a tax gatherer, tax collector, he was probably castigated from being a Levite, but it didn't mean he didn't have his ways into the temple to get a temple record. The only place these records were stored, it was in the temple. You wouldn't be able to get it and just say, let me go on Ancestry.com and find out who I'm related to. That's not what Matthew did, okay? Maybe that's a possibility that he had some way to go into the temple or somebody to bring him that record to support this genealogy. Possible. I got a better one that's probably even closer to possible. Matthew was a tax gatherer. In order to collect taxes under the Roman government, you didn't tax people by what they said they made. In a few weeks, most of you are going to be doing 1040s, right? You're going to fill out your taxes. You're going to go on TurboTax or whatever possible thing, or go to an accountant, Nathan, or somebody that's going to sit down and ask you questions. You're going to fill out all these things, and at some point they're going to say, now you owe the government this much money. And you can say, oh, why would I want to pay the government? It's robbing me. Okay? But you're paying taxes in America based on income. In Rome, tax was based on family. You had to have family records. Remember, Joseph and Mary, Jesus was there too. Joseph and Mary had to go back to Joseph's hometown of Bethlehem because he was from the family and the tribe of Judah, the family of David. That was his hometown. He was Davidic. He had to have proof that was his hometown to be taxed by. You kind of get that? Matthew is a tax gatherer. Possibility, he got it that way. Either way, Jesus' family was taxed based on their family records. Then someone will say, well, how did Luke get it? Luke's kind of interesting. Do you realize Luke writes all about women? And we'll kind of cover this when we go back over there because I want you to see this. But Luke was probably the family doctor in the area. And Luke could have got the record because he was a birthing people. And when you get a birth record, you have to have a genealogical record to give out a birth. They don't do it like they do now. Who's your mother? Who's your father? Here's your paper. Okay? So Luke's possibility of why he got it, because no other gospel writer had a genealogy, and we discussed that already. So let's since we tied that together to a Davidic line, let's look at some of these ideas that's going on. Because if you look in your Bibles, when we get to verse 2, there's a smooth transition from verses 2 all the way through verse 6. There's a connection, Judah to David. That connects the first part from where Israel went as a nation to the throne. Okay, and we'll talk about this as we do it. But the names are skipped. Now, if Matthew did get that record, the way he had got it, probably it was just a written record. The names that were skipped weren't skipped. They just weren't in it. And I'm sure many of you can go back in your records and find some record going back, but somebody may be skipped because of a clerical error or because they just didn't leave it out. I don't believe this was a clerical error. I think it was on purpose. Okay? And remember, Matthew has 3 14s in verse 17 for a purpose. And we'll look at that when we get there. I'll leave that as my cliffhanger. But if you look at this, there are 4 names skipped. And when we look at this, after the reign of Solomon, the kingdom of Israel was split. So here's what happens. David has a son named Solomon. Solomon becomes king of Israel, and Solomon dies. And he leaves his kingdom. And if you look at the kings, it's kind of interesting. If you ever went through the kings, some were good, some were bad. Bad kings had good sons. Good kings had good sons, and good kings had okay sons, and bad kings had good sons, and bad kings had bad kings. Okay? What does it show? It shows that people will be bad because they're bad, or good because they're influenced by God. So we have this line of David that are considered like their father David, or evil, and not doing what David did. And this is what happens when these two divide. When the two kingdoms divide, the northern kingdom is made up of 10 tribes. Really 11. Sometimes Joseph was considered Ephraim and Manasseh. They went to the north, and the southern kingdom was Judah and Benjamin. So the tribe of the kings remained in the south. So how many have I lost so far? We're doing okay? Okay, we're okay. Okay? This period of time, I had a professor in college, and I love what he called this period of time. It was called the chaotic kingdom. And I will say this, after David and Solomon, until Jesus comes again, we have nothing but chaos. Think about it a minute as you go through biblical history. Everything was in chaos. The 3 names between Uzziah and Jotham, so if you let your eyes go to verse 9, it says, to Uzziah was born Jotham, and to Jotham Ahaz. There's 3 names missing between Uzziah and Jotham. It's Joash. No, you don't have to write these down because I'm going to go back to them in a minute. It's Joash, Amaziah, and Azariah. And during this chaotic kingdom, if you were to read through the Bible and try and write down certain things and try and line them up, some of these kings had 1 or 2 names. Some may even have had 3 names during this kingdom time because there was so much chaos going on. And it's hard. So if you write things down and try and make graphs or pull up graphs or charts on the internet, and you find out all these kings are all over the place, and some people, there's some list of kings that actually leave these 3 kings totally out, and some don't, and some have the wrong names in there because there's dualities of things. It's not like Bobby said in the first class, where Saul and Paul were both his names, these were names that were attributed to who would call that king a specific name and which writer's writing about him. What's their background? So when we look at these, for instance, Joash, the first one is also known as Jehoash. So which one is he? Well, he's both. In order to understand him, let's first deal with his father, Uzziah, also known as Ahaziah. Now, don't write all these down. I just want you to see the chaos going on. Okay, as this kingdom is coming to a place where there will be in what it'll say in verse 11, to the deportation of Babylon. There's a de-evolving of the kingdom. The kingdom is wavering constantly. God has chastised them and put them under punishment. The northern kingdom will go into captivity in 722 BC to Assyria. By about 606, when the first deportation probably happens, is when the southern kingdom will be put into captivity for Babylon. And after that time period, there will never be a king on the throne of Israel again until the one with the genealogy can once again rise and rule and come again and sit on that throne. So that's why we got a picture of this. So when we look at Uzziah, he began his reign in 841 BC, and he reigned for a year. He was cursed with a wicked grandmother named Jezebel and an ungodly and vicious mother who actually puts herself on the throne after he dies. She enthrones herself. How well does that work? Her name doesn't make Matthew chapter 1. He has the shortest reign of any Judean king, being killed by a strong man named Jehu as he visited his uncle, who was the king of the north, and was wounded in battle. So Azariah, basically, it's in 2 Kings 9. I'm just going to give you some facts because I want to get to who Joash is. So Athaliah, who's his mother, assumes the throne for 6 years. It's the only known woman ever to rule in the history of the kings in both halves of the nation of Israel. Just think about that for a minute. It was a self-imposed rule, because one thing we know, as we look at the kings of Judah, the southern kingdom, it was all Davidic kings except for her. And she's not even considered part of the kings. The northern kingdom, you wanted to be king, is real easy. Kill the guy in charge. And most of the kings succeeded to the throne because they annihilated the guy who was in that position. So you look and it's murder and mayhem, murder and mayhem. Southern kingdom, chaos and more chaos. And the picture over all of Israel is this: they were idolaters, and the kings allowed it. And to what extent did the kings allow it? And Athaliah was an opening of Pandora's box. So this Athaliah was the daughter of wicked King Ahab and his wonderful wife Jezebel, who's pictured in Revelation. Okay? That's how great she was. So when she arrested and executed all the babies of the Davidic line except for one. She had gotten all the. So when you go to 2 Kings, you'd read that she took all the kings that were available and killed them all the seed that was available except for one. So you could see God's hand protecting the one. And Joash was the one, and he reigns at the ripe age of 7, he takes the throne. Okay? And he was a good king until Jehoiada died. Then all hell breaks loose. What Jehoiada did, he was the high priest who basically kept things spiritually calm. And he dies, and it goes crazy. This guy, Joash, has Zechariah stoned to death for preaching against sin. It's not the same Zechariah that wrote the book of Zechariah. It's a different Zechariah, but he has him stoned for preaching against sin. That works, right? Get rid of people preaching against sin. I think that fits the first class too. Bobby's talking about Paul. What did people want to do? Get rid of Paul. What was Paul teaching about? You're a sinner. You're evil. Here's your Messiah. Accept him. That was the message of the kingdom. And you need him. That was a nutshell. That wasn't the whole message. But later, Joash himself is murdered by his servants. So that's the first name of the left out list. What do you do with a guy like that? Okay, why did his name get left out? Oh, he's a sinner. He's crazy. Well, if you look at the list, whoa. We're going to have some fun with some of these names on this list. There's actually a chapter in the Bible. If I was writing the Bible, I would have left it out. Want to know why? We'll look at it later. I would have left it out because it's hard for me to explain it. When I'm reading it, even going like, you ever read something in the Bible and going, I know it's God's word. I know it's inspired. But could you have left this out? Because as a Bible teacher, I'm not going to skip it. So I'm going to teach it to y'all. And I'm going, and people walk up and say, God lets that happen. See, that's not God. Don't be stupid. God's God because God knows man will do what? Man will fail, right? So God's given man an ability to understand grace. Second king. So we got Joash and we got Amaziah. Amaziah begins his reign about 796 BC. I'm not nailing these dates. I'm going to tell you why. So we can all be on the same page and now maybe on the same calendar. During the time Matthew's writing and some of the other writers, there were multiple calendars. If you open up your calendar right now, and we all open up our calendar, we'll all have the same dates, right? There's an old joke that goes, does Canada celebrate, let me say it right, does Canada observe July 4th? And the answer is what? Yes, they all have the same calendar. They don't do all fireworks. They have a different day for that. Canada's just interesting. They have Boxing Day. Everybody know what Boxing? When I first heard Boxing Day, what would you think it was? That's when you take your Christmas presents and bring them back. What do we call that? A crazy day, don't go. But when you look at these things, when you talk about calendars, they didn't have one unified calendar. The Hebrews always went by a really good calendar. They went by the moon. They had a lunar calendar. They knew when the first day of the week was. They knew when the first day of the month was. They knew everything by looking up and seeing the moon. However, if you ever look at our calendars, they'll put the moons in there, the full moons and the new moons, but you say, that's like in the middle of the month. So what calendar are they going by? So there's different calendars that came out. So since that happened and the records weren't, oh, look, I'm writing down, today I took notes and I put down 224. That's not true. I put down 223. It was a day off. Then I changed it to 224:19. So if somebody picks up my notes 100 years from now, they know I wrote that on 224:19. They didn't do that back then. So you have to sort of backdate things when things happen. I know that was a segment you needed for your glorification. So, but when I say dates, don't come up to me later and say, I think and believe it was really 796 or 797 or 7. We're close, but I do know he reigned for 29 years. Okay, so Amaziah reigned for 29 years. He killed all who had killed his father Joash. So all his servants of Joash that killed him, he killed. He challenged the king of the north, Jehoahaziah, to battle, and he was badly defeated. He later was murdered by his own assassin. This all happens in 2 Kings. That was the life of Amaziah. Yippee. Okay, 2 Kings 14. Azariah, who also is known as Uzziah, who's Uzziah, not the Uzziah that's in Matthew. Okay, I see some eyes going like this. Don't take something. Don't bite a pencil. Because you don't know how much. Listen, I had papers all over my office and writing things down and going, and I go, what was that one? I got to go back and redo it. Because I got to touch paper and write things down person. So I got a stack about this high so far of papers. Because it's chaotic, remember. So Azariah began his reign in about 783 BC. He reigned 52 years. At the same time, though, he was co-regent with his father. See, what happens is a lot of kings overlap. Because daddy can't handle it, or daddy's not doing well, or daddy kind of splits his kingdom and says, you roll that, because I don't want to deal with those people, and they co-reign. Okay, and for the most part, he was a good king. Later became proud and attempted to assume the office of priest as well as king. For this, he was smitten by God with leprosy. All in 2 Kings chapter 15. So what's the point? What do we do with this? Well, I believe more than anything, these guys, these three kings, allowed one of the highest rates of idolatry in Israel. Just look with me for a few minutes. We're going to go to a few passages. Numbers chapter 3. Numbers chapter 3. Now, first of all, what we're going to look at is who's allowed to be priest, because I think that's important. Because we know from King Saul assumed the place of being a priest in Israel, and what happened to him? He was cut off, never allowed to be king, and no one from the tribe of Benjamin was ever allowed to rule in that position ever again. And in Numbers chapter 3, verse 10, it says, "So you shall appoint Aaron and his sons, and they may keep their priesthood, but the layman who comes near shall be put to death." So God warns, if you're not from the tribe of Levi and you come near, you're going to die. You're going to die. And some people will take that threat and say, well, let's see how close I can get and God not kill me. Verse 38 says this, same chapter. "Now those who are to camp before the tabernacle eastward, before the tent of meeting towards sunrise, are Moses and Aaron and his sons, performing the duties of the sanctuary for the obligation of the sons of Israel. But the layman coming near was to be put to death." So Israel is given the mandate, if someone other than a Levite comes before the tent of meeting and prostrate as a priest, kill him. Kill him. Now, if you ever look through Israel's rules about putting people to death, or what we would call capital punishment, Israel wasn't very good at carrying out God's rules. Otherwise, they would have thinned the flocks a little bit. But they didn't. So they were disobedient to God. And you say, oh, we can't do that. Well, we can't because we're not Israel. Relax. In 1 Samuel, we hear the record of what David had done, what Saul had done, becoming a priest. And only in Psalm 110, verse 4, is the Messiah to hold the office of Messiah, priest, king, and prophet. Those three things he would have. So the Messiah, who we know is Jesus, can only be priest. Is he a priest? Read the book of Hebrews. Is he a prophet? Many times in the Gospels he's presented as a prophet, teaching even better than their own teachers, one with authority. So that means all of Israel's teachers taught, but without any what? Authority. Because they weren't teaching from God's word, they were teaching from their word. And he was also king, and we're looking at Matthew's record to prove he is the rightful heir to the throne of Israel. Cool, isn't that? So what happens? Why are these guys left out? Well, I think the big answer comes in Exodus chapter 20. Now remember, the kings of Judah were to lead the people, not just governmentally, but spiritually. As the kings went, so the nation went. Can you say something similar to the United States? As the president goes, so goes the nation? Anybody believe that? You should. Every time he tweets something happens in the market, something happens in some cost of something. Everything's rocked by what this guy says because he's the president. But he's not your pastor. Thank God. So when you voted in December for a president, all these Christians just kind of, he's the most godly man. No, he is not. He's not. I don't care what he is. Pick the right guy for the office. He's not your pastor. Expect him to be what? More than human. Fallible. Thank you. That's the word I was looking for. We're all in the same place. So Exodus chapter 20 says this, very interesting. And I think this applies to what we're dealing with. Again, this is a possibility. I just hold it at the highest. Okay? And since I'm teaching, I get to say this. But I want you to think about it. Assume, and then go check it out. Verse 1 says this. Then God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. So God is addressing Moses directly, who's going to be a mediator between God himself and the people. And he's going to tell the people what they need, and this is their constitutional bylaws. Okay? So first one he says is, you shall have no other gods before me. That's pretty good. That nation should be monotheistic with the one true God, who is both Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Yes, even in the Old Testament, okay? They understood that somewhat. They were to be that nation that's so different from the nation they just left. Do you know what Egypt was? Polytheistic. They had a god for everything. Their dashboards of their chariots were filled with gods. Think about it. If you don't know, read the 10 plagues, and those 10 plagues had to do with every god of Egypt. Every god of Egypt. It goes on in verse 4, you shall not make for yourself an idol or the likeness of what is in heaven above or on earth beneath or in the water under the earth. You shall not worship them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting, here's the key, visiting the iniquity of fathers on the children, on the third and fourth generations of those who hate me. These 3 kings hated God. They weren't just sinners. They hated God because they not only allowed idolatry, they never did anything about it. And I believe that's why they were just sponged out of the record. Who needs them? Possibility. Matthew chapter 1. Let's talk about the next king that's left out. And this one will make your head totally spin. Okay, so if we need an exorcist done later, see me after church. We're going to have to do something, because this is difficult. Because I was taught years ago, there was a curse put on the kings, and was cursed one king. That's not true. So don't always believe what somebody says. Do what? Verify the assumptions. Okay? And if you verify, you'll find out what I'm about to teach you, so I'm taking the work out of it. There's one more king that's missing. When we look at Jehoiakim, in verse 12, it says Jeconiah was born Shealtiel, and to Shealtiel Zerubbabel. There's a missing king there, because it goes from Josiah to his grandson Jeconiah. Jehoiakim is missing. Jehoiakim is also known as various names. We're going to deal with that in a minute, but I want to deal with what he has. Now, first of all, in order to understand that, you got to understand what was going on in Israel at the time. So we're going to get some more history. Now, I don't know about you all. When I was in school, they required you to take a history class every year. It was a different history class, but they required you to take a different history class, and if you didn't take these history classes, you couldn't graduate. And in my school, since I went to a Christian school, they even offered, one class was on Israeli history. The teacher basically said, read 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and write a paper. My class was over. Now, as a kid, if you ever read some of those books, you would think what? Oh my goodness, what's with these names? Can't there be a Pete and a Benjamin and something easy? Sorry, Ben. Can't there be something easy? What's with these names? Some of these names, I don't know how they called them. I don't know about you. I played a sport. Everybody had a nickname. You never called the guy by his first name. You called him a nickname. So these weren't even nicknames. I don't even know if you can come up, Joikey. I don't know if that would be the guy's name. But let's just back up a little bit and look at verse 11, and we're going to look at Josiah for a minute. Because it says to Josiah was born Jeconiah, which is wrong. But let me explain something to you about the Hebrew of the time. There was no name for a grandson or a grandfather. They would just say, son. Now, I'm going to say something, so this will help you tie things together. I am the son of my father and my mother. I'm also the son of Noah. And I could put Noah in my well, actually, let's back up I could put Shem in my history. I know I'm a Shemite somewhere in there. Okay? You all might not be, but we all came off the same boat. So in our lineage would be what? Noah. And in all our lineage, which should be, if you're biblical, is what? Adam. Okay? So we all have common ancestors, and we can all walk around and say, I'm a son of Adam. And biblically, if you go to 1 Corinthians, Corinthians calls us in Adams. We're all in Adams. We have a kinship, common ancestry in a guy named Adam. And because of Adam, we all have a common problem. Say it? Sin. You guys got to quit sitting in the front row. I'm going to be tossing books all day. Okay, but it's sin. Okay? The kings are the same way. Just because they said son of doesn't mean they weren't son of. So it's partially correct, but for conversation, it did skip one. And it does skip a king. Here's what happened, though. Josiah began his reign in 640 BC, which was after the northern kingdom had gone into captivity. He reigns for 31 years, which puts him on the precipice of the Babylonian captivity. During this time, Egypt is also oversight of Israel. So you have Egypt and you have Babylon, and Egypt and Babylon are pretty much similar in their style of running government. They don't want to overrule you and capture you. They want to slowly anesthetize you into being Egyptian or Babylonian. So they're going to find ways to take you in. So from the time of Josiah, afterwards, the kings were amalgamated either as a puppet king or vassal king of Egypt or vassal or puppet king of Babylon. You with me? So Josiah is really the last, almost last seated king in Israel. And we'll talk about what happens. Now here's a really good king. He basically went in and repaired the temple. He discovers a copy of the law of Moses. And he tries to bring it out so people can now go back and read Moses' words. What was happening up until then? Where were they getting their information from? The priesthood and the kings, allowing the priest to be able to teach the people. And the prophets, big thing, were speaking to God, to the people. So if you look at the rise of the prophets, this is when they started coming up. All the prophets started coming in this time. Boom. You're getting a double blast of God going on. Josiah has 3 sons. The first one is Johanan. We're not even sure what happens to him. Some history says he might have died. His second son is Jehoiakim, also known as Eliakim. His third son is Zedekiah, who later will rule, but never really is a seated king. He is the puppet of Israel. So some charts will say Zedekiah was a king, but he's not. And we're not talking about his line anyway. We're not talking about Shallum, who's the last son, who's also known as Jehoahaz. We're not talking about those because that's not the line that it comes through. This perfectly aligns up with 1 Chronicles chapter 3, another one of my favorite chapters of begets. We all have that memorized yet? You know what's interesting, though? The Bible is meant to be memorized. And how many of you would say, hey, the 2 books I'm going to start memorizing is Deuteronomy and Chronicles? How many of you have that on top of your memorization list? Yet Jesus quoted mostly from Deuteronomy, and the records of history is from Chronicles. How did they get it? Maybe another option is they just knew it. I don't know about you all. If I knew everybody's genealogy, I'd have way too much overload of information. You know, I met a kid when he was about 3 years old, and he knew every president and vice president at the time. He's naming presidents. I didn't even know that if they weren't on a bill. I never saw them. And he's naming presidents and vice presidents and what happened and how they got out of office and all these things. I'm going, how'd you do that? Because he was taught that. And I met him back again a couple of years ago when I went to Kansas City, and he still knows the presidents and vice presidents. There's certain things you just got to forget. Move on. I'm happy I remember the last one and trying to forget the one before him. So that's too political. I know. I'm sorry. So let's talk about Jehoahaz, who is Shalom, also known as Shalom. He was a king in 609 BC, but he was not in the line, so we can forget about him, kind of thing. So Jehoahaz has Jehoiakim, and Jehoiakim reigned from 609, and it lasted 11 years. Now, 609 is right on the doorsteps of the Babylonian captivity. He has a son who was schizophrenic, because the names are all over the place. It's either Jeconiah, Coniah, or Jehoiakim, That one's not even close, but these are different names, and I believe the Babylonians and the Egyptians were co-naming what they wanted the kings to be. If you don't know that, read Daniel. All Daniel and his friends had their name changed. We think of Daniel, we know of Daniel, but how many call him his real name? Well, that's a good. Who knows Daniel's name that the Babylonians gave him? There you go, the two people over here. But he's never called that again, is he? Yet Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are never called their Hebrew names again. We only know them by their Babylonian given names, okay? Which is kind of fascinating in and of itself. So why is he skipped? Why is this guy skipped? Let's kind of investigate why is he skipped and a possible understanding. You know, I knew this would take this long. That's why I skipped it last week. And one of the things we're looking at, first of all, he's in a line of cursed kings. They're cursed, and we'll look at that in a minute. Actually, let's just go there. Go to Jeremiah 36, because what most people do is attribute the curse to Jeconiah, but it began with Daddy. And what we have is a trickle down. And I believe the bigger reason that he was skipped was Jeremiah 36, verse 30. It says, "Therefore, thus says the Lord concerning Jehoiakim, king of Judah, he shall have," listen, it's so clear, I don't know how people miss this. "He shall have no one to sit on the throne of David, and his dead body shall be cast in the heat of day and the frost of night. I shall also punish him," and read it, "his descendants." Well, who are we talking about? We're talking about the guy not in the list. He was cursed. And God said, basically, that's it. We're done. Now, we're dealing with a time frame that where's the Babylonians' deportation? We know it's about 606, the first deportation. But what was happening in that kingdom, other than being chaotic, there wasn't really a rule that he would be considered because he was cut off from ruling. Kind of get the picture? Look at Jeremiah 22, since we're here. Now, we're talking about his son. Remember, God already says, "No one from your descendants shall rule Israel again." Now, there's a big problem with that, isn't there? We're looking in Matthew, his genealogy of the king, and Jesus is in that genealogy, and Jesus can't rule. I love the Bible. It is so great that God is gracious enough for us to understand certain things. We're looking in Matthew at Joseph, Jesus' legal earthly father's lineage, not Miriam's. He had every right to rule because this is in his birth line. He got no DNA. He doesn't know any of these guys other than that they're related to his father, his earthly father, Joseph. So yes, no one can rule. Joseph couldn't have ruled his father, his earthly father. His half-brothers, let's see, Judah, and Jacob, neither one of them could rule because they had no right because they've been cursed. Even though they did pass that nicely on to Jesus, saying, "We're not going to rule, we're going to be your bondservants." Okay? But as Jeremiah 22 says this, verse 24. Jeremiah 22, verse 24. "As I live, declares the Lord," which is kind of fascinating. You ever think of that? The Lord saying, "As I live." He's swearing on himself and he's saying, as long as I live, this is going to happen. Wait a second. When's that not going to happen? I mean, everybody understands that God's what? Eternal, right? No beginning, no end. So when he says, "as long as I live," so "as I live, declares the Lord, even though Coniah, the son of Jehoiakim, were a signet ring on my right hand, that I would pull it off, I shall give you over into the hand of those who are seeking your life, yes, into the hand of those who dread, even the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and into the hand of the Chaldeans. I shall hurl you and your mother who bore you into another country where you were not born, and there you will die." That's called Babylon. That's just not good. It's not good for a king to die outside of Israel and to be buried who knows where. Well, he's not done, though. "But as for the land to which you desire to return, they will not return to it. Is this man Coniah a despised, shattered jar? Or is he an undesirable vessel? Why have he and his descendants hurled out and cast into the land that they have known, a land, O land, land, land? Hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord, write this man childless. Now, it doesn't mean he couldn't have children. It means he couldn't have kings. There would never be another king in Israel sitting on that throne that would rule over Israel in his line. Coniah's the last. And then they're sent into a deportation. And someone will say, well, Zedekiah ruled. Zedekiah was his uncle who had no right to the throne, and he was absolute puppet king. The hands of Babylon were running his life. And then he was brought into captivity and had a horrible end. Okay, but from the time of the deportation and when Israel later returns, there's never a seated king in Israel again. Some people will say, well, Zerubbabel, when he returned, he was given the signet ring. But he was only governor. He was given the right to govern, not the right to rule. Big difference. You with me so far? So what I see, why is his name left out? The best thing we can look is the curse that was given to his father that trickled to him, and that curse would balance the generations to come. And one of the things we could see is that as Coniah took over the throne, minutes later they were taken into captivity. Fascinating things we see. I'm going to go as quickly as I can with a couple more questions because I do want to get somewhere here. How could have Israel missed the Messiah if chapter 1 is so clear? Now, this is a tongue-in-cheek double answer. First of all, they didn't. Right? How many of you are pretty good church historians? First church was made up of all what? Gentiles? Not a Jew was in it. It was all made up of what? Jews. So they didn't miss him. As a nation, they rejected him. Wrong question. Learn to ask the question right. Why did they reject their king as a nation? It's a better question. And the other thing is, why is it so clear? How could they have missed it? Because they had a double judicial blindness on them. Isaiah chapter 6 mentions it, and Isaiah chapter 29 mentions that they would not see and not hear and not understand. And then Jesus repeats it a couple of times in the Gospels, and then Paul repeats it in Romans. They had a judicial blindness. So here's a good prayer for you as we go through the week. Pray that Jewish people have the veil removed from their eyes. And God will lift it as you give out the gospel to them. So it puts you in a position to do that and to be that person. The Old Testament closes, and this is where I really wanted to get this morning. The Old Testament closes with Malachi. What's the real purposes that Matthew serves as we open the Greek scriptures? Now, most of you have a Bible, and if it's a good enough Bible, it'll say Malachi chapter 4, you turn the page, it'll say intertestamental period or something similar to that, and another page will say New Testament. Please take that page and tear it out. There's nothing new about it, and it's not a testament. That is Latin. It is the Greek scriptures, and it opens up with the continuation of the same thing that was going on. It's the Paul Harvey of the Bible. It's the rest of the story. Here's the interesting thing. Matthew is the closest relationship to the Old Testament. It quotes over 129 times in the Old Testament. If you don't know the Old Testament, you really are lost in the book of Matthew. Now, we just spent almost an hour just dealing with 4 kings. Because we're going back in biblical history that Matthew assumes you know. What if we did that with every character in chapter 1? I was thinking about doing that. And by that time, we'd be done with most of what? Old Testament in its totality, probably. Because with each king, there was a prophet, and with each prophet, there was a prophecy he was giving and a direction he was going. Could you imagine if we did that? Matthew's assuming you know that. So here's a good thing for you to do if you want to be challenged. Go through Matthew, take a name, study something about it. Take a name, study something about it. If I said to you the first 2 names are David and Abraham, how much do you know about Abraham? How much do you know about the Davidic covenant? Those 2 guys are important. How much do you go back? How much do you know about the Abrahamic covenant? How much do you know of the life of David? I mean, we think we could say Abraham was what? What's the title of Abraham in the Bible? Okay, I'll go with that one too. Father what? A nation. But his title he's given by God is what? He's a friend of God. What's David? David's a man after God's own heart. Why? Both of those guys were failures. I once did a whole sermon series on the testing of Abraham and God's curve. Because God graded on curve. Abraham would give a test and he'd get an F. God would give another test. There was only two possibilities in God's test. Pass or fail. Okay? We go A, B, C's, and D. No, pass or fail. And Abraham would get a test, fail, get a test, fail, get a test, fail, get a test, fail. What's with this guy? And we always remember the test he passed. He brought his son to sacrifice his son. And we say, see, look, Abraham's a great God, man of God. Oh, no. Be careful with that. How about Peter? Peter's another one. Great man of God, right? But we know one thing, people are what? We're back to the same thing, fallible. And God exposes the people to us to say these are just normal people. They're just as fallible as we are. And we could see that clearly. So when we look at this, it's also fascinating to look at. They both, listen, you go to the Old Testament. It begins, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's how Genesis opens. A book of Genesis, Bereshit, in the beginning. We have the book of the beginning, so we have all the beginnings. You know, Matthew opens the same way. Matthew opens up, book of Genesis. What's it saying? What that began, this will conclude. I think it's fascinating. You know, once in a while, you got to go out of it and see what does it really say. Because our Bible says this is the book of the genealogies of Jesus Christ. It's the book of Genesis. This is the real beginning. This is where it began, because if he didn't come, why are we here? If he didn't come, what's the answer to sin? What's the answers in life? There are no answers, because we're all going to die. You need an answer before you die. Because after that, it's just a second death. See, what Matthew gives us, where Malachi stopped, it says, there is going to be a man that comes, and this man is going to be king. He is going to be the king of all kings. He is not only going to be the king, he is going to be the Lord of lords. And all of history has focused on this one moment in human history when a woman gave birth to the seed of God, and they would call him Jesus, which means Emmanuel, God with us. All of history, look for that moment. That moment in history needs a response from us. What are we going to respond with? How do we respond to this baby born in Bethlehem? Think about that for a minute. We're going to conclude here. Next week we'll pick up with the next questions. I got about 20 more questions left. But the basic question before us is we're challenged constantly with the idea, who is Jesus? What's the importance with Jesus? And scoffers will come, and mockers will come, and they'll say, he's not Jesus. He's not the Jesus who was expected. We expected someone to come to rule and to reign. And what they don't understand is there could be no ruling and reigning without the cross first. Because the cross is so important to the crown. Anybody could pick up a crown and rule. But what he did is he paid for our sins by that death on the cross, making us one with him. We're in Christ, and when he comes, we're going to rule and reign with him. That's a story for a whole different time. Well, let's stand. I think we're singing something. Where did the paper go? I'm at a loss.